I'm John Buchanan, and in this video we're going to look at a plugin which could potentially be added to a folder name called Tools You Didn't Know You Had. That's right, it's time to look at the Spectral Gate. Now you might already be thinking, never heard of it, but it's there, I promise. Okay, before we find it, let's just have a listen to the beat loop that we will start our processing journey with the Spectral Gate on. Here it sounds, this is what it sounds like. I said, here it sounds. Indeed, there it sounded. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to come and find the Spectral Gate. And Spectral Gate actually exists within the filter section of Logic. It's right down here at the bottom, which of course is why you've never spotted it. It's also one of Logic's really pretty plugins. Okay, so of course I'm not going to repeat what I said on the multipressor video, but it's fair to say that Apple, when you have time, maybe have a look at this. Okay, so this is obviously, again, one of those processors that's been around for an awfully long time, but it doesn't change the fact that actually it's capable of doing some really interesting things. So what exactly are we looking at here? Well, as its name suggests, the Spectral Gate is a kind of gate, but for different frequency spectrums. And effectively, we have two within Spectral Gate. We can split a signal into two. And those areas we can refer to as treble or bass, or as they're referred to within Spectral Gate, super energy and sub energy. So the first thing we can do is to set a threshold to separate those two separate bands. And you can see that as I move the threshold dial upside down, or up and down, I should say, effectively what we're doing is either making most things fit within the sub-energy area, in other words, we're raising the threshold or the cutoff point between those two areas, or as I drop it, then effectively we're sort of putting more of the signal into the super energy area. So the threshold point literally sets a point between high frequency content and low frequency content before we then process it. We'll ignore this section for now. We're coming back here in a moment. What we can then do is to choose what's referred to as the center frequency. So remember, because this is a spectral effect, what we are doing effectively is setting a filter point somewhere, wherever we want to put it. And then what we can also do is to choose a bandwidth. And the moment we do that, effectively the Spectral Gate starts to make a little bit more sense. What we've effectively got here is a band pass filter, specifically around an area here, a frequency point that we're selecting here. And then we've got a bandwidth to select how wide that band is going to be. So either we can work on a very narrow band of frequencies or a much broader band. Okay, what I'm going to do is to make sure that my two modulation points are at 0. We don't want any modulation. Again, I'm going to come back here in a moment. And let's just press play and begin to hear what we can do with just these fixed parameters. Okay, so now this beat loop, spectrally gated, sounds like this. Okay, so we've got this really amazingly kind of early digital aliasy, quite nasty sound, but that's okay. We're going to deal with nasty and do something useful with it. Okay, so the next dials that I've got available, which we're going to look at, are over here. Firstly, I've got a volume sort of control for the processed area that is the high frequency content. In other words, the super energy. So I've got an opportunity to decide how loud I want that to be. And then I've got the same thing for the sub energy as well. So if I want to take the processed areas and change their volumes, I can. Okay, I've got to be careful not to overload the signal. Too late. Sorry, Will. Okay, so there we are. We've got our two separate areas of processed signal. But what I can also do is to bring back in some of the original signal on either side of my selected band area. In other words, if what I want to do is to bring in some of the high frequency content from the original loop, I can do that here. And if I want to bring in some of the low frequency area outside of the processed area, I can do that over here on the left-hand side. So let's start by bringing in the high frequencies and then the low. So if I want to bring in those areas on either side of this processed middle section, I've got a chance to do that with these amazingly attractive green lines. I promised I wasn't going to do that, and now you see I'm getting sarcastic. They are amazingly attractive. Really? Okay, so there we are. We've got our opportunity to bring in the signal. Okay, so back to the modulation section. What exactly can I do here? Well, what I've got is a low frequency oscillator, which is over here on this slider, and I can choose a speed for it. Now, the range of this isn't massive. The maximum speed is 2 Hertz. And this would be a good time for me to tell you that I've slightly cheated by selecting a tempo of 120 beats per minute. I'm tempted to be really enigmatic and just say, why do you think I've cheated? But I will do the maths for you. So if I've got 2 cycles per second and I've got a tempo which is absolutely divisible by seconds, as 120 beats per minute is, just as 60 beats per minute would be, then of course effectively what I've got a chance to do is to clock the speed of my LFO to the tempo of my project. So there you go, I promise, full disclosure, I have cheated. But the reason why I've done that is because I think in terms of a musical result, it's interesting to hear what happens when we do work with a sort of tempo synced opportunity to modulate the parameters that are available to us. Now, to demonstrate this, I'm going to turn down the low and the high levels. So effectively, we're just now listening to the spectrally gated bands that we're working on. And what I have a chance to do is to introduce my LFO to 2 separate parameters, one of which is the central frequency, and one of which is the bandwidth of that central frequency, or around that central frequency. So let's start with the center frequency. What this is now going to do is to basically move that up and down. So effectively we're going to get frequency movement from low to high to low to high. And of course, if I want to kind of create this amount of movement, but I want to start from a sort of lower bass, then I can absolutely do that. Okay, so that's that. And what I can then do as well is to bring in modulation of the bandwidth, which effectively is going to squeeze the kind of left and right hand margins closer together and further apart. Now what you can hear is that obviously depending on where I put the center frequency, we start to pick up the top of the kick drum on this loop, or we're just dealing with a kind of mid-range area into the hats, and effectively we can create these quite interesting, quite liquid effects. Now the other thing that's going to make a big difference is the threshold point. Now again, we tend to think about threshold as being volume related, but effectively remember what this is doing is to decide which of the 2 frequency areas sounds are being sort of apportioned into. Apportioned. That's this week's word of the week. Okay, so what I have a chance to do is to experiment with the threshold point as well. And in combination with the cutoff frequency modulation, the center frequency modulation, and the bandwidth modulation, we can actually get a really different effect just by leaving those other parameters alone, but just playing with those. Okay, so what does this sort of sound like? Well, obviously it sounds like this, but what does it sound like when we effectively use it in a slightly different context? You can hear that what the Spectral Gate is doing is effectively creating this incredibly sort of resonant band of frequencies in this kind of mid upper range, because that's the area that I've chosen to sort of focus on. And by bringing in some of the low level and the high level, I'm bringing in a ghost of the kind of original beat loop underneath it. But effectively, we're still focusing on upper frequency content. Now, what I'm interested to do now isn't to sort of see this as a replacement for my beat loop, but potentially as an addition to it. Now, there's no mix dial within Spectral Gate. I haven't got an opportunity to say, right, I want to bring all the original signal back in and I just want to blend a little bit of this in. But that doesn't mean that I can't use it in parallel. But in order to do that, what I'm going to do is to set up an auxiliary bus. Bus number 1 is free. I'll turn up the level to it. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to use Spectral Gate over here. Now, what that basically means is we're going to get all of the original signal, which is playing back from the original channel, but it's also being sent to the auxiliary bus where Spectral Gate will be added as well as the original loop. So what effectively it's doing is giving us this quite digital, quite aliasy kind of topper on top of the original loop. Now that's hearing it on the drums. And of course, the reason why I've demonstrated on drums is because in the original loop, we've got a lot of kick and we've got a lot of mid-range and we've got a lot of treble. And so we can begin to see very easily what happens with the Spectral Gate when it's using, or when it's got the potential to use, a really wide frequency area. What happens if we start putting on a different, maybe more pitch-based instrument instead? Okay, well, what I'm going to do to start with is just play you the beat loop and this little sort of bassline sequence, which I've just brought in from Apple Loops. And for now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to completely mute the Spectral Gate track. Now, remember, I haven't done anything with the bassline with Spectral Gate yet anyway, but this is turning it off from the beat loop. Okay, so the only things that I've done to this bass line is to put an auto filter on it because I want to be able to change the frequency content of this. I just literally want to be able to filter it, and I've put a little bit of delay on it as well. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to set up the auxiliary bus send that I set up from the beat loop. So effectively this sound is also now being sent into Spectral Gate, which I'm going to unmute. And to make it clear, I'm going to turn off the send from the beat loop. So the beat loop is now just being a beat loop with no spectral gating. And actually for a moment, I'm going to mute it anyway. And instead what we're going to do is to listen to what this sounds like now on a pitched instrument. Now, what's interesting is you just begin to hear those kind of upper frequency, kind of quite liquid moments. But of course, they're going to become more extreme as I feed more frequency content in from this bassline. Remember, one of the plugins that I've put on this sound is the auto filter, and at the moment it's using a low pass filter and the cutoff frequency is quite low. So the Spectral Gate is going to come alive much more as I begin to open up the cutoff frequency. Okay, now let's do the same thing without the spectral gate, just so you can hear the difference. I'm just going to play all the way through this loop a couple of times with that filter movement, and then the second time I'll punch in the spectral gate so you can hear what difference it's making. So this is without the spectral gate. And with. That's really nice. Now, one thing that would be really interesting just before we wrap up would be to just solo the spectral gate and to continue to move the frequency content which is feeding it so that we can actually have a chance to hear what it sounds like without just on its own. So we can actually really hear how it comes alive through the different frequency range. So even at this really low sort of cutoff, we get these really interesting liquid kind of zaps. We can hear those much more clearly just when the sort of frequency area opens up. So if you're looking for a way to bring a pretty unusual, quite digital sounding overtone sort of effect really to the tracks that you're working on, this is really worth exploring. Yes, the interface is horrible to look at, but the number of parameters is small and it's pretty easy to understand exactly what you're looking at. And the great thing is that because those things are true, it's really easy just to see or to find out very quickly whether or not this is going to be of use to you in the track that you're working on. But it's definitely another way, a bit like almost adding a sort of high shelf EQ, or by looking at sort of exciters or something like that, another way of being able to get a kind of slightly weird, wonky, interesting effect into our tracks.